Miyoko Sumida raced down the sidewalk in Amagasaki, Japan, trying to will her body to go faster. Miyoko was 63 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time she had run. Her lungs were on fire, and her legs felt heavy. Even though it was a cool day out, she could feel the heavy eyeliner and mascara she always wore starting to run down her face. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to just stop, but she knew that whatever she did, she couldn't stop. She had already waited too long. Miyoko darted across the street and rounded a corner. Ahead of her, the city spread out. In the distance was Amagasaki Castle. It was a white 17th century building, with these graceful layers of traditional Japanese curved roofs, and it stood in stark contrast to the rest of the city, which was all low, boxy apartment buildings and factories and warehouses. Miyoko turned a final corner, and there it was, the police station. She ran inside, and she called out for help. A police officer came out from behind a window, and in between breaths, Miyoko blurted out the reason she had come. One of her closest friends had gone missing. But the officer just stood there and stared at her calmly and told her to please slow down. Suddenly, Miyoko became aware of what she must look like. A little old, frail lady with crazy hair, panting and gasping on the verge of tears. So she tried to steady herself and calm down and start from the beginning. In a shaky voice, Miyoko explained that her next-door neighbor had disappeared. Her neighbor's name was Kai Ope. She was in her 40s, and she was a wonderful, caring friend. But a few days ago, Kai had gotten into a strange car right outside her condominium, and nobody had seen her since. It was like she had vanished into thin air, and so Miyoko worried something terrible had happened to Kai, and now she wished she had come to the police sooner. The officer assured Miyoko that he would file a report and the police would look into this right away. But the officer also said that very likely there was a rational explanation here for why her friend had left. Miyoko began to breathe a bit easier. She told herself everything would be okay. The police would find Kai and bring her home. On the 9th of November, 2011, a week and a half after Miyoko reported Kai missing, a foreman and his work crew arrived at an old abandoned warehouse in the industrial section of Amagasaki. This warehouse was only a few miles from where Kai had last been seen, but the foreman and his crew didn't know anything about that. They just knew this was where the job they had been hired for was taking place. They were supposed to move some cargo that had been left inside the warehouse to a new location. When the foreman led the crew inside, they saw this vast, mostly empty space with trash and dust on the concrete floor and cobwebs on the walls. There were a few labeled crates scattered around, and so the foreman told his men to start moving them out to the truck. And as the crew took each item out, the foreman would mark it off his list. But then, at some point, one of the workers noticed something tucked away in a dark corner of the warehouse. The worker walked over to it and realized it was this big metal drum, like a barrel that might be used to store oil. At first, he just assumed it was part of the cargo they were supposed to move. So he grabbed it and tried to slide it across the floor, but the drum didn't budge. The worker laughed at himself. He was a pretty strong guy, and he figured he should be able to move a single metal drum on his own. So he took a breath, squatted down, gripped the top of the drum, and tried really hard to pull it out of the corner. But still, it didn't move. A couple of the other workers saw him doing this, and so they joined him in the corner. Together, they all gripped the metal drum and pulled, and it moved but barely. At this point, the foreman came over to see if he could help. When he did, he immediately noticed that this drum did not have any markings on it, and he thought that was very strange, because the other items they had come to move had all been very clearly labeled. And so the foreman glanced down at his list, and he did not see the metal drum anywhere on it. This sudden mystery got the crew excited, and they wondered what might be inside of this drum. Maybe there was something valuable or illegal. The foreman thought about just leaving the drum alone, but if it was a valuable item that somehow didn't make it onto this list but was required to be moved, well, the client would be angry if it was left behind. So the foreman told his crew to open the drum to see what was inside. Then they'd figure out what to do with it. The men were all in good spirits and joking with each other as they pulled on the lid, and the foreman could feel his heart beating faster with the anticipation of what they might find inside. Suddenly, The metal lid came loose, and it clanged to the floor. The foreman and his men leaned over the barrel to see what was inside, and for a second, there was absolute silence in the warehouse. As the foreman stared down into the drum, it was like everything around him disappeared. Finally, one of his men let out this awful, strangled scream, and it was like it snapped the foreman back into reality. He fumbled to dig his phone out of his pocket, and then, with a shaking hand, he dialed 110, the emergency line for police. Not long after the foreman made that call, the lead investigator on the case, Officer Seto, walked into the warehouse, along with dozens of police officers and forensic analysts. The foreman and his crew were still inside, but they had all moved as far away as they could from the drum. Officer Seto nodded at the men but did not stop to talk to them. Instead, he headed straight for the drum in the corner of the room. When he reached it and he peered inside, he gave a long, sad sigh. Inside the drum was the twisted body of a dead woman, and there was something else inside of that drum that also horrified Seto. Someone had poured cement inside the drum, and it had hardened and partially encased the woman's lower body. But he could still see enough of the victim to guess that she was probably in her 60s. She had gray hair and wrinkles. Seto could also see that she had bruising on her neck and face. She was completely naked, and she was shockingly thin, almost emaciated. As Seto stared down at the body, he felt his stomach turn. There was a true level of cruelty in the way this victim had been disposed of that hit him hard. But beyond his emotional reaction to this, Seto was also confused, because this scene didn't make sense. It was like this victim didn't match up with this crime scene. If the body of this woman had been found in her home, he could have at least started to wrap his mind around it. Because approximately 1/3 of women who are murdered in Japan are killed by current or former intimate male partners. Most of those murders occur inside the home, but this didn't look anything like a domestic violence killing. In fact, Seto could only think of a few instances that involved covering up and abandoning a body like this, and all of those instances were connected to gang violence. In Japan, these gangs are referred to as yakuza, which is kind of like saying the mafia. Seto knew there were yakuza groups in the city. They typically engaged in financial crimes like extortion, smuggling, and prostitution. But there were occasional episodes of major violence, including murder. Still, yakuza violence typically occurred between different gang factions, not between gang members and normal, everyday people. And Seto just couldn't imagine how the victim, this older woman, could have possibly gotten mixed up with the local gang. Seto called over a forensics officer. The forensics officer joined Seto and then stared down into the metal drum. He told Seto the bruising on the woman's face and neck suggested she had been beaten before she was killed, and her body had not decomposed much, which could indicate that she had been killed recently. However, they wouldn't know until the autopsy. Seto nodded, and then stepped away from the drum and slowly walked around the warehouse looking for more evidence. He didn't see any blood on the walls or floors, and there also weren't any rope fibers that would indicate the woman had been bound or held captive in the warehouse. In fact, other than the body, there really was no sign of any violence. But that lack of evidence actually helped Seto begin to form an early theory about what might have happened. He believed the victim was most likely murdered somewhere else, and then placed in the metal drum, and then transported and hidden in this warehouse. A few minutes later, Seto headed back to the police station. He knew he really needed the autopsy before his investigation would have a clear direction, because the autopsy would show him who the victim was. However, in the meantime, he decided that the way the body was disposed of was a decent enough lead to get started. The Yakuza had been known to leave their victims in metal drums, so he would start with them. The following day, members of Seto's investigative team fanned out to the dark corners of Amagasaki. Back in the 1980s and 90s, and even into the early 2000s, the Yakuza had operated pretty openly in certain bars and restaurants. People could always tell the establishments where the Yakuza were running brothels, because there would be a scantily clad hostess at the door trying to entice customers to come inside. And then, when those customers stepped through the door, the whole place would be lit with a strange, bright pink light. And if they wanted to spend some money, they could go upstairs and pay for sex. But now, the Japanese police had begun a crackdown on Yakuza activities, passing a series of anti-gang laws and targeting different parts of their operations. And so when Seto's team talked to people in the seediest bars and restaurants in town, they didn't really come up with anything. It seemed like the Yakuza were just laying low, not murdering women and stuffing their bodies into barrels. Seto began to worry that this Yakuza lead was just going to take his team to a dead end. But then, just a couple of days after the discovery of the body, the autopsy results arrived on Seto's desk. Now, the report couldn't answer when this woman had died. It was impossible to tell if she had been dead for days or months. However, the report did give the identity of the victim. Using dental records, authorities had identified her as Kazuko, a 66-year-old woman who had lived in the city. Seto kept on reading the autopsy, and when he finished it, he found. Attached at the back was this additional report, and when he read this additional report, he was shocked. The report said the dead woman found in the barrel was the mother of Kai Oa, a woman who'd recently been reported missing. But that was not the craziest thing, because the missing woman, Kai, had not been missing at all. A few days after Kai's neighbor, an older woman named Miyoko Sumida, had filed a missing persons report. The police had tracked down Kai just 20 minutes away in the major city of Osaka. And it would turn out, Kai had been hiding out there using a fake name. Very suspicious. And so Seto quickly contacted the officers who'd found Kai, and they told him that when they'd located her, they had no idea her mother was dead. And so there was no connection drawn about perhaps Kai being involved in the death. And since it was not illegal for her to run away and hide out in a different city and pretend to be somebody else, Kai had simply been brought home and allowed to return to her normal life like nothing had happened. Now Seto's mind began to race. He wondered if the case was really just this simple. Maybe it had nothing to do with the Yakuza. Maybe Kai had just murdered her own mother and then fled. Seto knew he would have to act fast, because Kai had already tried to escape once, and so he didn't want her to catch wind that he was looking for her. She might try it again. So Seto quickly flagged down another investigator, and the two of them both ran out to Seto's car and sped through the city. When Officer Seto and the other investigator knocked on the front door of Kai's condominium, a short, nervous-looking man in his 40s greeted them. Now, the man was polite, but it seemed fairly obvious that he did not want them to come inside. The man told Seto that he and his family knew about how Kazuko had been found in the drum in the warehouse, and so they just wanted privacy to deal with their grief. But Seto told the man that he really needed to ask some questions, and they could either talk here in his home, or the man and his family could come to the police station. The man turned around and scanned the apartment behind him, like he was looking for something. Then he muttered something under his breath and turned back to Seto and said, "Okay, you can come inside." Seto and the other investigator paused to remove their shoes. Then they followed the man into the front room, and Seto couldn't explain it. But right away he felt like something was off here. He asked the man if he was related to the murder victim, Kazuko, and the man said yes, she was his mother-in-law. But then he quickly corrected himself and said, actually, she was his former mother-in-law. He was divorced from her daughter, but he still lived in the condo with his ex-wife, their kids, and Kazuko. This surprised Seto. Why would a divorced couple keep living together? But he just smiled and nodded. He wanted to keep the man talking very comfortably, and just because the living situation seemed odd to him, that didn't mean there was anything wrong with it. Eventually, Seto got to the point and asked the man if his ex-wife was Kai Oa, the woman who had gone missing and then returned. The man shook his head. He said he had been married to Kai's younger sister, but Kai actually also lived with them in the condo. The man paused and again looked around the room like he was searching for something. Then he turned back to Seto and just began to laugh. Seto glanced at the other investigator, and he looked as creeped out as Seto did. There was something so strange about this man, and it wasn't just that he clearly was very nervous. A lot of people get nervous talking to the police, so they were used to that. This weirdness was something else. Once the man stopped laughing, Seto asked him if Kai was home, and the man turned and pointed to a closed bedroom door. Seto got up and walked over to it, knocked, and announced he was a police officer and asked if he could come inside. There was a brief silence, and then Sado heard light footsteps from inside the room. Slowly, the door opened. And when Sado saw who opened the door, he had to consciously hide his shock, because the woman standing in front of him looked like a corpse. She was rail thin, and her eyes seemed hollowed out in her face. Sado could see there were stains on her shirt, and her hair was stringy and greasy, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He asked her if she was Kai, and she just nodded. Sado stepped into the room while the other investigator stayed back with the man. In the room, Sado saw there was a plate on the floor with scraps of food on it, and also clothes were piled up in different spots. The room smelled sort of musty, like the door hadn't been opened in a long time. Sado wondered when Kai had last left her bedroom. The silence was broken when Kai said she knew why he was there. She had actually been expecting the police ever since she got the news that her mother's body had been found in that warehouse. Sado asked if she knew what had happened to her mother, and in a voice so quiet that Sado had to lean in to hear her, Kai said, "My mother took her own life." This absolutely stunned Sado. If it was a lie, it was a really stupid one, because why would Kai expect him to believe that her mother had, put herself into a concrete-filled drum? Or was she suggesting that her mother had killed herself, and then Kai, or maybe somebody else in her family, had then disposed of the body by putting it in the drum? Sado waited for Kai to say more, but she didn't. She just went quiet. Finally, when the silence between them had become deafening, Sado asked her, "Hey, why'd you run off to Osaka a couple of weeks earlier?" Kai seemed to force a smile, and then said the whole thing was a big misunderstanding. She had just gone on a quick trip, and was surprised anybody even noticed she was gone. Now, this made perhaps less sense than even the idea that Kai's mother had put herself in the drum. But Sado stayed quiet. He didn't want her to know that he was sort of onto her. He was a big believer in letting people trap themselves through their own words. But before Kai could say any more, Sado heard new voices outside the room, and he turned to see 3 people outside in the front room approaching his other investigator. Kai told Sado that the 3 people were her sister and her sister's young teenage daughters. Sado gestured to Kai to come with him, and then the 2 of them stepped out of her bedroom and headed towards the front room. Sado introduced himself to the rest of Kai's family, and then shot another look at his partner like, "What's going on here?" The sister and the children looked as bad as Kai, like they hadn't eaten or slept in days. And when Sado asked them the same basic questions about Kazuko's death that he had asked Kai, he noticed their eyes dart back and forth like they were trying to communicate with each other without actually saying anything. And when they did speak, they all said the same thing, that Kazuko had taken her own life. Sado felt like this whole situation was just insane. He had arrived here thinking maybe Kai was involved in her mother's death. But now, after seeing Kai and her family and the unsettling way they were all living, he had no idea what was going on here. Why were they all so sickly? And why were they telling such transparent lies? Sato didn't know if these people were guilty or innocent, but he did know one thing for sure. They were hiding something. He told the family the police would be following up soon, and then he and his partner stepped outside. Once they were back on the street, Sato turned to his partner and said, "Hey, while we're here, let's talk to the neighbors. Maybe someone has a clue about what's really going on inside that condo." They began knocking on doors, but one by one, the neighbors would either say they knew nothing or just quietly retreat back inside. It wasn't surprising. In Japan, people are often reluctant to speak about another family's affairs, especially if it involves something illegal or the loss of a loved one. But Sato had hoped for at least one helpful interview. He pulled out the missing persons report that had originally been filed for Kai Oa. The woman who filed Aitan older neighbor named Miyoko Sumida lived right next door. The officers had already knocked on her door earlier, but she hadn't answered. Still, Sato figured it was worth one more try. After all, if anyone knew more about the family, it'd be the woman who first reported Kai missing. This time, when they knocked, Miyoko actually answered, but she looked terrified. She quickly apologized and said she had nothing more to say, then shut the door again before they could respond. Sato and his partner were just about to give up and leave when a door behind them creaked open. A young couple stepped out of their apartment and, to the officer's surprise, invited them in. Once inside, the couple revealed something horrifying. A few months earlier, they had been out walking in a nearby park when they suddenly heard a woman screaming. When they looked over, they saw something they'd never forget. Kai, her sister, her brother-in-law, and even their daughters. They were all beating Kai's mother, Kazuko. The couple immediately called the police, but when officers arrived, they barely spoke to the family. Instead, they had a quiet conversation with them, then left a few minutes later and never followed up. Sadly, this didn't surprise Sato either. At the time, domestic abuse cases in Japan were often handled very differently from other crimes. Because of that same cultural respect for privacy, even violence inside the family was often seen as a private matter. But this wasn't some private argument. This was a public assault, and now the victim was dead. As Sato and his partner left the couple's apartment, his mind was spinning. He already knew Kazuko had been beaten before she died. There were bruises all over her neck. And now he had confirmation that her own family had physically attacked her. But this new information only made the case more confusing. Because after seeing Kai and the rest of her family in that condo, Sato didn't think they were even physically capable of carrying out a murder like this. Kai looked like she could barely stand. The others were just as frail. So how could they have possibly killed Kazuko, moved her body, and stuffed her into that concrete-filled drum? Sato didn't have the answer, and at this point, he wasn't even sure where to look. But then, the next afternoon, while sitting at his desk, trying to figure out his next move, Sato's phone rang. He picked it up. The man on the other end spoke in a whisper, barely audible. "I have important information about Kazuko Owa's murder." Sato felt a jolt of adrenaline surge through him. He immediately stood up at his desk. He asked the man who he was, but the caller wouldn't say. Sato didn't want to scare him off, so he didn't press. The man continued. He said he didn't know exactly how Kazuko had died, but he was certain of one thing: her family was under the control of a ruthless Yakuza gang. And this particular gang, he said, was run by the most terrifying Yakuza boss in the entire city. And then the line went dead. Sato stood there frozen. It was like he was suddenly transported back to the very first moment of the investigation, back when he stood in that dark warehouse, staring down at the drum, wondering if this was Yakuza business. He decided right then to dive into the Owa family's finances. Because if there's one thing the Yakuza care about, it's money. And almost immediately, a pattern began to emerge. Over the past 2 years, the Owa family had made repeated large payments at regular intervals, a group later traced back to a known Yakuza front. Suddenly, it all made sense. Sato now believed the family had gotten themselves into debt with the wrong people, and Kazuko had paid the price. On the 26th of November, 2011, just over 2 weeks after Kazuko's body had been found, Sato had 5 known Yakuza members brought in for questioning. But, as expected, they said nothing. Yakuza members rarely cooperate with police, and after 5 silent interviews, Sato still had no direct evidence linking any of them to the murder. Worse, he still had no idea who this gang's ruthless leader really was. By the time 2011 came to a close, Sato had hit yet another dead end. And then months passed. With no new leads, the trail grew cold. He started to believe he might never find out what really happened to Kazuko. But then, nearly a year later, on the 14th of October, 2012, everything changed. That morning, 2 officers from the Amagasaki Police Department knocked on the door of a small, empty-looking one-story house in a quiet neighborhood. They were following up on an anonymous tip. From the outside, the house looked like any other home on the block. But the moment they stepped inside, they knew something was wrong. A faint, rotting odor drifted through the front room. The power was out, so the officers turned on their flashlights and headed deeper into the hallway. The farther they went, the worse it got. The smell intensified. Toward the back of the house, the officers found a room that was closed off by traditional Japanese sliding doors, with wood frames covered in opaque paper. As they approached it, the rotten smell became almost unbearable. They braced themselves and then opened the sliding doors. Inside, they saw 6 large tatami mats made of thick woven straw covering the floor. Traditionally, shoes and socks would be removed before stepping on these mats. But the officers just quickly walked into the room because they were sure that whatever they were looking for was somewhere inside of here. The rotten smell seemed to be coming from somewhere below them. So one of the officers crouched down, held his breath, grabbed the edge of the mat in the center of the room, and started to pull. And as the mat slid away, darkness opened up beneath it, and the officer shouted to his partner to come look. Under the mat, there was a hole in the floor, and when the officers peered down inside of it, what they saw made them want to run out of the room and vomit. Because at the bottom of that hole, partially encased in cement, were 3 naked, decomposing bodies. These officers quickly alerted Officer Sato, and it didn't take long for Sato to discover that these 3 new victims shared a common link with his original victim, Kazuko O. This link was a person who they were all very close to. It would turn out all 4 of these victims had been the victims of the Yakuza. There was a ruthless Yakuza leader who had overseen all of their murders. But Sato would soon learn that these murders were just the tip of the iceberg. This particular gang leader had overseen the murder of multiple entire families over the last 25 years. Based on evidence discovered at several crime scenes, and from interviews conducted over the course of a year, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kazuko Oath on the night of the 11th of September, 2011, 2 months before Kazuko's body would be found. The ruthless Yakuza leader reclined on a luxurious couch in a room filled with high-end furniture and artwork. The leader checked the time and then picked up a phone and made a call. One of the killers answered, and without hesitating, the leader told the killer, "Now." Then the leader hung up, tossed the phone on the couch, and calmly waited. Not long after that, the 2 killers stood outside of Kazuko's bedroom, where she was fast asleep. After a minute, they signaled to each other that they were ready. Then they opened the door and rushed Kazuko's bed and leapt on top of her. Kazuko woke up to the sight of fists flying at her face. She tried to fight off the killers, but they had her pinned down, and each punch left her dazed and writhing in pain. She tried to cry out, but she was too weak. The killers brushed away Kazuko's arms as she tried desperately to protect herself, and they kept on pounding her in the face, the neck, and the head until Kazuko just stopped fighting back. When Kazuko went still and the killers realized she was dead, they climbed off the bed and backed out of the room. Back in the front room, one of the killers called the leader to say the job was done. But the leader just laughed and told the killers to stay right there because the job was not, in fact, done. The killers did exactly what they were told. They always did exactly what they were told. They stood there in complete silence, waiting. Finally, the front door opened, and the ruthless Yakuza leader walked into the condominium. The killers led the leader into Kazuko's bedroom. The leader stared at Kazuko's body and then barked for the killers to move her to the bathtub and cover her with ice. The killers obeyed, and once Kazuko's body lay under a blanket of ice, the leader brought the killers back to the front room. There, the leader told them to write a suicide note and to make sure the note included Kazuko's last wishes, that Kazuko wanted to leave all of her money, her possessions, and property to the Yakuza leader. The leader then told the killers that the last thing they would have to do was secure a metal drum so that other members of the gang could transport the drum with Kazuko's body inside to a warehouse. The killers nodded silently. Once the plan was set, the leader smiled at the killers and then turned around and walked back outside and went right back next door to the condominium where they lived and went back to relaxing on the couch. The ruthless Yakuza leader who had ordered the brutal murder of Kazuko O and who had presided for more than 2 decades over a secret and twisted reign of terror was literally the last person Sadato or anyone else had expected when this investigation began. Because the leader didn't look like some hardened criminal who could rule people through physical intimidation. Instead, she looked like a kind old woman. Her name was Miyoko Sumida. She was the 63-year-old woman who had rushed to the police to tell them that her neighbor, Kai, had gone missing, and she was so upset about it. But to just call Miyoko a Yakuza leader would be a huge understatement. Miyoko was more like a serial killer and a cult leader. Over the course of their investigation, Sato and his team discovered that Miyoko's introduction to cruelty and brutality had come at a very young age. She grew up in Amagasaki during the chaos of post-World War II Japan, when the country was trying to recover from the devastation of the war. During that time, certain areas of the country bordered on lawlessness, and Miyoko's father had taken full advantage of that. Miyoko's father had been a very successful contractor who brought in North Korean laborers to work for him. He let those workers live in his home and eat his food, but he also beat those workers every day, took 40% of their wages, and threatened to kill them if they didn't do exactly as he asked. And so, over time, out of fear and desperation, these men became completely obedient to Miyoko's father. And Miyoko had watched all of this very closely, and even had begun to study her father's methods. Then, in her 20s, Miyoko herself entered into a life of crime, using a lot of what she had learned from her father. Her first major foray into the criminal world had been to buy one of those bars with the bright pink lights on the seedy side of the city that offered customers the opportunity to pay for sex. That had allowed Miyoko to meet members of the local Yakuzas and to familiarize herself with their tactics. When she was ready, she sold the bar and assembled a gang of her own. She recruited family, friends, and other people she trusted. Miyoko set out to get as much money and power as she possibly could, and using threats of violence from her gang played a role in her plans. But Miyoko went far beyond typical Yakuza violence to get what she wanted, because just like her father, Miyoko understood that fear alone was not enough to own people. Her victims, they had to need her. In a way, Miyoko made her victims love her. To do this, she targeted families that owned property or businesses. She infiltrated those families by offering things like financial assistance to help their businesses grow. And at first, people viewed her as a generous benefactor, a kind, wealthy woman who just wanted to help others succeed. But once Miyoko gained a family's trust, she used what some might call mind control to gain power over them. She would start by turning members of the family against each other, causing problems in their house or in their business, and then blaming those problems on one specific family member. And through her financial assistance, Mi would start to make that family feel dependent on her to survive, just like her father had done with the laborers. And Miyoko would also use her money as a way to get family members to do favors for her. These favors started out small and got bigger over time, and slowly the family would grow more and more obedient. And while all this was happening, Miyoko would start to make rules about when a family could eat, when they could sleep, who they could talk to, and when they could go outside. And if any of them pushed back, Miyoko would order her gang to inflict serious physical harm on them. The 20th of October, 1986, Captain Alexander Kliuyev was piloting a passenger plane that was about to descend down into a Russian airport for a layover. On board this plane were 94 occupants, including passengers and crew. And as the captain began going over in his mind the different steps he would need to follow to land this plane, he practically sighed with boredom. He had always thought life as a pilot would be exciting and interesting, but all he ever did were these short commercial flights around Russia, and they lacked any sort of thrill. In fact, the captain had flown this particular route so many times, he could practically do it in his sleep. And so, as the captain was about to begin yet another boring descent, to end yet another boring flight, he was suddenly struck with a very unexpected idea. And as he thought about it, he stopped what he was doing, and he just turned to his co-pilot, whose name was Gennady Zhernov, and he said, "Hey Gennady, can I ask you something?" At the same time that Captain Alexander and Gennady were having this conversation up in the cockpit, down on the ground inside of that Russian airport where the captain was supposed to land, an air traffic controller noticed on their radar that Captain Alexander's plane was coming in way too fast and at too steep of an angle to attempt a landing. And so the controller radioed up to the captain and said, "Hey, you're going too fast. Adjust your speed, adjust your angle, otherwise you're going to need to abort this landing." But the captain did not radio anything back to the controller. Instead, the plane continued its descent at the same angle and the same speed. And to the controller's horror, they looked out the window and literally saw the plane was lowering its landing gear like. Clearly they are going to attempt to land, even though this looks so dangerous. And so the controller, in a bit of a panic, radios again up to the captain and says, "Hey, you're still coming in too fast, too steep of an angle. Abort the landing." But again, the captain did not respond. What Captain Alexander had said to Gennady when he said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" was, "Hey, do you want to make a bet that I can land this plane blind?" And Gennady, who was also very bored, thought, "You know what? That's a great idea. Let's do it." And so the two pilots lowered all the shades inside of the cockpit, blocking all of the windows, so Captain Alexander literally can't see anything except for his instruments. And then Captain Alexander attempted to land the plane. And when the air traffic controller began calling up to Captain Alexander saying, "You're going too fast, your angle's wrong," Captain Alexander was sure he could pull it off. And so he totally ignored the controller and went for the runway. And when he hit the runway, he was going too fast, at too steep of an angle, and so it broke off the landing gear. The plane skidded all the way down the runway and then flipped over and caught on fire. Out of the 94 people who were on board that plane, 70 would perish, including the co-pilot, Gennady Zhurnov. As for Captain Alexander, who orchestrated this whole tragedy well, he actually survived, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Late on the afternoon of the 22nd of March, 2015, 29-year-old Denise Huskins reached for her buzzing cell phone, and when she saw who was texting her, she immediately felt this knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Aaron Quinn. And right now, at least according to Denise, they were off. And likely it was going to stay that way. But now, Aaron was texting Denise, saying he really wanted to talk to her, and would she please come over. It was a Sunday, and Denise was home alone in her little apartment in Vallejo, California, which is inside the San Francisco Bay Area. And Denise really just did not have it in her to go talk to her ex-boyfriend. Really, she didn't have plans to go out anywhere. She just wanted to stay in. And so she typed back that she was in for the night and this would have to wait. But as soon as she sent that text, immediately she got another text from Aaron. For a long minute, Denise just sat there on the couch, looking at her phone, wondering what she was going to do. Denise and Aaron had met the previous summer, after Denise had moved to Vallejo from Boston, Massachusetts, to work at a hospital in Vallejo called Kaiser Hospital. Denise had her PhD in physical therapy, and Kaiser Hospital had a great physical therapy program, especially for people with brain and spinal cord injuries. And Kaiser Hospital was also where Aaron worked. She and Aaron had been immediately attracted to each other. Aaron was tall and fit, with dark hair and piercing eyes, and he loved to cook. And Denise, she was blonde and blue-eyed and very outdoorsy and driven. And so, pretty much right away, Aaron and Denise would get into these intense conversations where they each would kind of dive into the other person's life. I mean, they were really connecting on a deep level. But even though they both clearly got along great and they were really connecting, their relationship got off to kind of a rocky start. Aaron had actually been engaged to be married before he met Denise, but Aaron's fiancée had cheated on him, and so he had ended the relationship. And it was during that time, right after this relationship had ended, that he met Denise. And so Denise was kind of like a rebound, and she kind of felt like a rebound. But again, they're getting along great, and so both were optimistic that it was more than that. And so Aaron and Denise had officially begun dating in the fall of 2014. But 7 months later, so in March of 2015, when Denise was getting these text messages from Aaron, at least in Denise's mind, their relationship really was done. Because Denise had caught Aaron texting his ex-fiancée, basically begging her to get back together with him. And so, Denise felt really hurt. You know, she understood that that was a really intense relationship. And of course, Aaron would still have feelings for his ex to some degree. But she felt really betrayed. And so she told Aaron that that was it. But it was really painful for Denise, because she did love Aaron, even though she knew, this relationship likely wasn't going to work. And now here Aaron was blowing up her cell phone with text messages to meet up and talk, and he just wasn't taking no for an answer. And so, Denise finally typed out this long message back to Aaron, basically saying, "Look, I don't feel comfortable coming to your house. It's the house that you shared with your ex. I don't want to go there. We can talk another time. I think for right now, what you need to focus on, Aaron, is kind of like courting me. Take me out on dates and show me that you really want to be with me. Because right now, there's no trust." And Aaron, to his credit, wrote back to Denise and basically said, "Yes, I'm definitely willing to do that. I want to put in the work to win you back. I care about you, Denise." But he said, "I really have something important to tell you, and I just don't feel comfortable talking about it anywhere else besides at my house. So please, can you just come over tonight? It's really important that I see you." And at first, Denise really did just kind of hold the line, and she told Aaron that, "No, I'm not going to come to your house." But again, Aaron, he just would not let it go. And he really seemed actually very eager to see Denise. And it made Denise feel special. And so eventually, she kind of gave it up and said, "You know what? Okay, I'll come by." And after that, Denise got up off the couch. She got dressed, she called their favorite pizza place, and ordered some pizza that she would pick up and bring to his house for them to eat that night. And then she headed out to her car and pulled out of her driveway. At about 5:30 p.m. that night, Denise arrived at Aaron's 2-story home on Mare Island, which is actually just a little peninsula in Vallejo, California. And Denise, she grabbed the pizzas off the passenger seat, she grabbed her overnight bag, because she was optimistic that, they're about to have a great talk and maybe rekindle, and maybe she'll stay the night. And so, with her things and her pizza, she walked up to the front door and knocked. The next day was a Monday, and Aaron and Denise were both scheduled to work at the hospital that day. But at around 7 a.m. that morning, Aaron called into the hospital sick and said he couldn't come in. And Denise sent a text message to her boss, saying that a family emergency had just come up and she would not be at work all week. When Denise's boss got this text message, immediately he was like, "This doesn't make any sense." First of all, Denise never missed work, so this was totally anomalous. And he also knew that Denise was applying for this very prestigious orthopedic fellowship that she needed to submit the paperwork for by Friday. And he knew she had a lot of work to do on this paperwork that basically required her to be at work that week to get it all done. And so, if she was missing the week, then it looked like she would not be applying for this fellowship. And that just seemed totally unusual, because Denise was really serious about this fellowship. And so, Denise's boss wrote back to her and just said, "I understand you have an emergency. We're here if you need us. Take whatever time you need." And then, a few hours later, her boss checked his phone again, and he saw that she had not written him back. And so, Denise's boss was like, "Wow, I guess, she really must be dealing with some serious family emergency that's keeping her from using her phone." About 7 hours later, at around 2 p.m. on this Monday, where Aaron and Denise have not shown up for work, there was a 911 call that came into the Vallejo Police Department. And the person making the 911 call was Aaron. And Aaron's voice was totally slurred, and then he told this very confusing story about some sort of kidnapping. And then he begged police for help. 2 police officers happened to be near Mare Island, where Aaron lived. And so within 2 minutes of this 911 call coming in, those 2 officers were knocking on Aaron's front door. And when Aaron let them inside, these officers noticed 3 things in quick succession. The first was, Aaron was obviously drunk or high. He was under the influence of some substance. He just did not seem right. 2, there were at least a dozen empty beer bottles lining a back wall in the kitchen. And 3, the entire house reeked of cleaning chemicals. One of the officers immediately turned to Aaron and said, "Are you on drugs?" And Aaron would say, "Yes, I am on drugs, but these drugs were given to me by the kidnappers." The officers immediately exchanged confused glances, looked back at Aaron, and then just said, "Okay, well, we're going to take a look around." And so the officers wound up going upstairs, and as they went upstairs, that cleaning chemical smell got stronger and stronger. And they made their way into the master bedroom, and they saw the ground had obviously been recently vacuumed, and that cleaning smell was really strong in here. The sheets on the bed were all gone, except for the fitted sheet that sat over the mattress. And so, the officers were about to leave the master bedroom and keep looking, when one of the officers stopped, and he noticed something on the bed. And he called the other officer over, and they walked over, and they looked down, and sure enough, on the bed was about a quarter-sized drop of blood. The police officers left the master bedroom, and they went back downstairs where Aaron was. And they walked up to him and said, "Okay, tell us again what happened with these kidnappers and what's going on here." And Aaron would launch into a totally bizarre story. Through slurred speech, Aaron would say 12 hours earlier, so around 3 o'clock in the morning, that morning, so early Monday morning, Aaron said he was in his house with his girlfriend, Denise, when suddenly, these men wearing wetsuits broke into the house. And they immediately tied up Aaron and Denise, and then made them wear these goggles that had been all taped up, so once they were on your face, you couldn't see anything. Aaron would tell the police that the intruders, in addition to wearing wetsuits, they also were carrying guns, tasers, also laser pointers, and also very high-powered flashlights. And so, when they came in, there were all these lights and beams everywhere. I mean, it was totally chaotic. Aaron then explained to police that after he and Denise had been tied up and had these goggles on, the men in wetsuits came over to them and put headphones on each of them. And then they played this recording, which had this weird soothing music, and then somebody narrating, telling Aaron and Denise that they were not in any danger, that this was just a robbery, and to stay calm and nothing would happen to them. And so, Aaron and Denise had done just that. They tried to follow orders, and then, at some point, the headphones came off, and both Aaron and Denise were told to go to separate rooms. And they kind of fumbled their way into the separate rooms, at which point, the men demanded they give up their banking information and passwords. And Aaron and Denise did that. They gave up all their banking info. They were brought back into the living room. They were tied back up again. And then, even though Aaron and Denise couldn't actually see this, they heard the sound of somebody apparently coming in that sounded like a doctor, who then took Aaron and Denise's blood pressure before administering this drug to them that made them both very sleepy. And then, before Aaron and Denise passed out from this drug, Denise was taken by the intruders, and the intruders told Aaron that they had rigged a camera system inside of his house to watch him, so he couldn't leave to go save Denise. And so, Aaron basically just stayed in the house until he fell asleep from this drug. And then, when he woke up again and managed to get his restraints off, he saw that Denise really was gone. And so, Denise had to be with the kidnappers. After Aaron was done telling this totally weird story, which, again, you've got to remember, as he's talking, he sounds totally drunk, and so they kept having to ask him to say again what he was saying, and, Aaron's just kind of loopy, and so the whole thing is just so weird. And so, when Aaron was finally done telling the story, the two officers just stared at him in silence. And then, the officers looked at each other, and without even saying anything, they both were thinking the same thing. Probably, this guy has killed his girlfriend Denise. And after he killed her, he must have spent time cleaning the house, which is why they smelled all the cleaning chemicals.
And then, maybe when he was done, he felt bad about what he had done, and so he began drinking beers to kind of cope with what he had done. And that's why all those empty bottles were there, and that's why he was acting so drunk right now. And then, at some point, he had worked up the courage to call 911 and pretend that he didn't know where his girlfriend was, and make up this whole alibi about these weird kidnappers that came in and did this stuff. But obviously, it was just a ruse. this guy killed his girlfriend. That's what happened. And so, finally, one of these officers spoke to Aaron, and they said, "You're going to need to come to the station with us and explain yourself." It didn't take long for the police in Vallejo to launch this massive search all over Mare Island to look for Denise. And at this point, they were kind of looking for a body. Because, based on what was going on in Aaron's house and the story he told, it did seem like, very likely, she had been murdered and disposed of somewhere. And so, they had dogs out and dive teams out in the water. They had hundreds of volunteers looking everywhere. And, at the same time, Aaron was brought to the police station, and they began going over every single detail of his story, trying to get more information about these kidnappers. Because, as much as they didn't believe him, they did need to officially rule out that there was no kidnapping. And so, they needed all the information about these kidnappers, who they were, what they looked like, what they sounded like, everything. And, at the same time police were talking to Aaron, police also brought in Denise's roommate. And they asked the roommate, "Do you know anything about Denise's relationship with Aaron?" And the roommate would say, "You know, those two have had a very troubled relationship." And the roommate would say that, as far as they understood, Aaron and Denise were not a couple anymore. And so, police would actually go over to Aaron in the police station, and they would say, "Hey, we have people saying that you and Denise, who you called your girlfriend, you guys were not dating. You had broken up. Explain yourself." And Aaron would say, "Well, actually, that's why Denise was coming over before all this kidnapping happened. She was coming over so we could reconcile. And we did. We had reconciled. We were back together when the kidnappers in wetsuits came inside the house." But the more police looked into Aaron's kidnapping story, the less it made sense. And it really didn't make sense to begin with. And so, really, it just got weirder and weirder and weirder. Like, for one, Aaron said that he and Denise had been kind of forced to give up their banking information and their passwords, and they gave that up to the kidnappers. But when police looked into Aaron and Denise's banking records, there was no money withdrawn. The only activity on either of those accounts was on Aaron's account 2 hours before Aaron called 911. He called his credit card holder and attempted to get them to give him a large cash advance so he could buy a boat. When police asked Aaron about the strong cleaning chemical smell in his house, Aaron absolutely denied doing anything to clean his house. He didn't know how that happened. Also, Aaron would tell police that these kidnappers had actually wanted a ransom to be paid to them, but he said it was only for $8,500. And so, police are like, why would these kidnappers take Denise and run away with her and risk very serious jail time for $8,500? It just seemed way too low for what they were doing. And then, there was another weird detail that came out of interviewing Aaron at the police station. One of the police officers had noticed that Aaron's eyes were totally dilated, his pupils were huge, and, for a little while, police had thought maybe that was because he was on some drug or something.
Which can cause your pupils to dilate. But based on the weirdness of the story that Aaron was relaying to them, they actually began to suspect that Aaron was having a schizophrenic break. That is a symptom of a schizophrenic break. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental illness that often begins to appear in young adults. And Aaron was only 30 years old, so he's at the right age for this to happen. And while schizophrenia does not make people violent, it does make people very paranoid, and it also can cause hallucinations and mental disturbances. And so, when police were looking at the details of Aaron's story about men in wetsuits breaking into his house and taking his blood pressure before stealing his girlfriend, but also cleaning his house at some point that just seemed so weird and kind of crazy that it did seem to kind of line up with schizophrenia. By 9 p.m. on the 23rd of March, so 7 hours after Aaron had called 911 to report Denise missing, the Vallejo police decided they needed to call in the FBI because this was just so weird. We have this missing person who could have been kidnapped, or maybe they're dead or hurt or something. I mean, there was just so much going on with this case they needed backup. And when the FBI arrived in Vallejo, the first thing they did is they took Aaron and they gave him a lie detector test, and he failed it completely. After finding out he had failed it completely, he immediately lawyered up. By the next day, the 24th of March, there were over 100 different search teams all across Mare Island and around Vallejo, California, looking for Denise. Police sonar had also picked up a body-sized mass out in the bay, but so far the divers had not been able to find it. Aaron, by this point, had gotten his lawyer and left the police station. And by now, Denise's picture was all over the news and newspapers. It was up on posters on telephone poles all over town, and television news channels were parked outside of Aaron's house, just waiting for him to come out or waiting for any activity. But despite all this activity, the detectives and the FBI agents that were working this case had really not made any significant progress. All they thought was, Aaron's definitely hiding something. But then something changed a little bit after noon on the 24th of March. A reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who was camped outside of Aaron's home, got a very weird email. The email was from the kidnappers, the wetsuit-wearing, blood pressure-taking kidnappers who broke into Aaron's home and took Denise. And in this email to the reporter, it said that Denise was fine, and there actually was a recording of Denise's voice reading that day's news, which confirmed that she was alive, at least as recently as that morning. But there were two very suspicious things about this email. The first one was the recording of Denise's voice, the proof of life recording. Well, she did not sound in any way stressed. She sounded utterly calm, like she was reading the news, like it was completely no big deal. Earlier today, there was a plane crash in the house. And the second thing that was very suspicious was the email address. The kidnappers had used to message this reporter an email address that belonged to Aaron. When this reporter told police about this, investigators were like, you know what? This actually doesn't make this any more clear. This makes things exponentially more confusing. Denise did appear to be alive, which was a good thing. But it now really appeared that Aaron was involved in whatever was going on here. And based on how calm Denise sounded on this recording, she could be involved in it too. And investigators' suspicions only grew when they went to Aaron and they asked him, you know, have the kidnappers tried calling you at any point? And Aaron would say, yes, they have. And he showed them his phone. Well, the police would trace the phone calls that Aaron claimed had come into his cell phone from the kidnappers. And when they traced the kidnapper's number, they found it was connected to a burner phone. A burner phone is something that, like, drug dealers will use because it's totally anonymous. It's like a one-time use cell phone that you use temporarily. You have this number temporarily, and then when you're done with the phone, there's no history that you personally had that cell phone. But police were clever, and they figured out where this burner phone was actually purchased from. It was purchased from a nearby Target. And they looked at the security footage around the time when this burner phone was purchased from this Target, and they saw the person who had bought it walk out of the store. And the person who had bought this burner phone was this white man who was tall and fit with dark hair, and it basically looked exactly like Aaron. And then, 2 days later, on the 25th of March, Denise herself walked up to her mother's home in Huntington Beach, California, which is roughly 400 miles south of Vallejo, California, where she went missing. And so, Denise's mother was not home when Denise showed up on her doorstep. And so, Denise wound up going to the next-door neighbor and using their phone to call her father. And Denise's story, that she would tell her dad, was even more bizarre than Aaron's story. She said she had been held captive by 4 men in a small room. And these men would tell her that they were simply doing a task for a client, and what they were doing now with her was just following their protocol. Denise would tell police that she was well taken care of while she was in captivity. They let her eat food, they gave her water, they even let her shower and brush her teeth. Denise initially was very open to speaking to Vallejo police detectives about what happened to her. But when they said the FBI really wanted to talk to her, and they would literally send a jet to her in Huntington Beach and fly her back to Vallejo, she refused. And then, like Aaron, she immediately lawyered up and stopped talking. And so, by this point, all the investigators are like, there's no way these two actually got kidnapped. This whole thing is some weird, elaborate hoax, and now they know they've been caught, and so they're going quiet. And so, that night that Denise was found, on the 25th of March, the Vallejo police held a press conference and told the public that they do not believe these two were ever kidnapped. They don't really know what happened, but at this point, they are not pursuing kidnappers, and the public should not be worried about rogue kidnappers in the area. But after this press conference, the police couldn't help but think to themselves, why would these two people, who are successful, they come from good families. They have loads of future prospects. I mean, their lives were good. Why would they stage this hoax? What do they stand to gain? It really just didn't make any sense. For weeks, the investigation into whatever happened to Aaron and Denise continued, but there was virtually no progress. The media was still very interested in this case. It was totally salacious, and they had dubbed this case the Gone Girl case, in reference to a movie about a woman who fakes her own kidnapping. As for Denise and Aaron, they stayed lawyered up, and the only message they put out to the public was that they were telling the truth. And so, really, this case just didn't make sense to anybody. Until about 2.5 months later, on the 5th of June, 2015, early that morning, a police officer in a town called Dublin, which is just south of Vallejo, California, found a piece of evidence that basically broke the Gone Girl case wide open. The evidence this police officer found was a cell phone, not a burner phone that's totally anonymous, but a real cell phone that is registered with a phone company and therefore is registered with an individual person. And police were able to trace this cell phone back to its owner, and this discovery would lead investigators 200 miles to the northeast of Vallejo, to the small, remote cabin in South Lake Tahoe, California. And at this cabin, police would find a stolen car, a white Mustang. And the white Mustang actually belonged to someone who lived in Vallejo. And so, with their guns drawn and their dogs at the ready to be released, the police and the FBI, they opened up the door to this cabin. And inside was a tall, fit, and slender white man with dark hair. The cabin was a total mess, with discarded food and trash and piles of clothes everywhere. But none of that really stood out to the police. Instead, what stood out to them as they're yelling at this guy to stay where he is all around the cabin, all over the ground, kind of on top of all the trash and mess, were things like laser pointers and high-powered flashlights and zip ties and goggles like swim goggles with tape all across the front of them, blocking out your view. The police had finally found one of the kidnappers. And while this kidnapper looked exactly like Aaron, he was a tall, fit, slender white man with dark hair. It wasn't Aaron. In fact, neither Aaron nor Denise had ever met this person. And this person, this kidnapper, had never met Denise or Aaron. There was absolutely no connection between them. This kidnapper's name was Matthew Muller, and he was a 38-year-old Harvard-trained lawyer and former Marine who had totally just crashed and burned out of his law practice and then took up this life of committing all these totally bizarre crimes. It would turn out the totally weird stories that Aaron and Denise had told police about what had happened to them was all true. The only thing they got wrong was there weren't multiple people breaking into the house in wetsuits. It was only ever one person. It was Matthew Mueller, the guy behind all this. And maybe, just kind of in their panic and not knowing what's going on, Aaron and Denise had kind of thought, oh, there's multiple people here. But there wasn't. It was just Matthew. Also, it would turn out Aaron and Denise were not the first people that Matthew had done this to. The reason that police officer in Dublin, California, had found that cell phone which broke the case wide open and led police to this cabin in South Lake Tahoe was because on the night that officer found the cell phone, so the 5th of June, Matthew Mueller had attacked another couple in the middle of the night in their home. But that couple had been able to fight Matthew Mueller off, and Matthew had dropped his cell phone in their home before he fled. And so, when this couple had reported this to police, that was how they got that cell phone. In terms of Muller's motivation for doing what he was doing well, Muller was absolutely brilliant. Like borderline genius, super smart guy. But he was extremely mentally unwell. He had severe psychosis, and he was also bipolar. And so, basically, he wasn't seeing reality for what it was. And at some point, in one of his kind of psychotic fits, he had somehow come across Aaron and Denise and become absolutely obsessed with them. He began surveilling them nonstop with a drone for 3 weeks before he attacked them, learning their patterns and who they talked to and what they did. And in fact, Aaron, when he found out that was what Matthew was doing, watching him and Denise with a drone, Aaron would tell police, "Oh my goodness, I actually remember one night before the kidnapping, looking up and seeing this glinting light in the sky. And he thought, that looks like a drone. Why is it out here?" But Aaron was a normal person and didn't suspect that somebody who was totally unhinged was spying on him with a drone, and so he had forgotten about it. And so, after Muller had surveilled Aaron and Denise for 3 weeks using his drone, he was ready. And so, in the middle of the night, he broke into Aaron's house wearing a wetsuit. He tied up Aaron and Denise, and he put those goggles on both of them so they couldn't see anything. And then he put on those headphones on both of them that played the soothing music and also had that narration where it was telling them, "Hey, you're going to be fine. This is a robbery. Just stay calm and do what you're told." But after these headphones went on both of them, Matthew would sexually assault Denise. And in fact, at least one other victim of Matthew Muller has come forward since his arrest to say that she too was sexually assaulted by Matt. And so, after Matt had taken Denise and left Aaron's house with her, Aaron, he did fall asleep from the drug he was given from Matthew. And then, when he woke up the next morning, he managed to get out of his restraints. And, he's still affected by the drug that was in his system, and he sees that Denise is gone. And so the first thing he does is, "Oh my God, I need to find a way to pay the ransom to this kidnapper." Because, again, the kidnapper, Matthew, had said around Aaron that he wanted $8,500. And so Aaron thought he could get that money, and so he called his credit card company and asked for that cash advance for $8,500 to pay this ransom. But when they asked Aaron why he needed this money, he didn't want to give up that it was for a ransom, because he didn't want the kidnapper to know that he had talked to authorities. He was worried about Denise. And so, kind of in a panic, Aaron just told the credit card company that he was buying a boat. But really, it was for the ransom. Also, Aaron was the one who called into Kaiser Hospital for both him and Denise, saying they were missing work. He did this because Matthew, at some point, had instructed Aaron that he would have to do that or something would happen to Denise. And so again, he's just kind of following the instructions, hoping that he can get Denise back. As for the email that the San Francisco Chronicle reporter got that apparently was from the kidnappers but was sent from Aaron's email account, well, that really was the kidnapper, Matthew Mueller, sending this email to the reporter. He just used a special program to basically hijack Aaron's email address. And as for Denise sounding very calm in her proof of life recording that was attached to that email, well, the thought is, Denise was very likely in shock at the time she was asked to record this, and so it sounded like she was relaxed, but really she wasn't. Also, just a random side note that I'm sure some of you will have questions about, we don't know why Aaron's house smelled like chemicals. It's assumed that, maybe when Aaron and Denise were all tied up and couldn't see anything because of their goggles, that Matthew Muller, I guess, walked around their house and cleaned it, but we don't know for sure. Matthew Muller is currently serving a 40-year sentence in prison for federal crimes, and just recently, he was sentenced to an additional 31 years in prison for state crimes that were in connection to the kidnappings of Aaron and Denise. Aaron and Denise would go on to sue the city of Vallejo, California, for basically mistreating them. They had been telling the truth the whole time, but nobody took them seriously, and they would win $2.5 million. Aaron and Denise would go on to get married. They would have a baby, and they would write a book together about their experience, which is called Victim F, from crime victims to suspects to survivors.